When you were a child and your parents disapproved of some behavior in which you were engaging, they probably told you to treat others the way that you wish to be treated. And this juvenile reprimand contains a principle that is important to life in a society where limited government and respect of individual freedoms are valued. And this is the idea that rights are reflexive, that if there is some capacity, some freedom within yourself that you cherish, you must respect its free exercise in another, of course, barring the infringement on your rights. And this really draws in part from Aristotle and from Adam Smith, because there are two components to this. One is consistency of character, and the other is the centrality of ego. Aristotle, right, the idea of the golden mean, which is essentially treat others the way that you want to be treated, actually talks about the doctrine of the mean in Book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. And this is the idea that virtue is a mean which is found between excess and deficiency. So you can have actions which are overflowing with virtue and actions that are totally lacking in virtue. And this is possible because virtue is not simply the act of doing right, but there are many conditionalities which must be met. Aristotle tells us that there is one way to do right and many ways to do wrong. And this is because virtue is a state of character which is developed over time. Because virtue involves choosing the right action for the right reasons at the right time, at the right place, in reference to the right object. And it really involves the ability to engage with one's reason and to determine what in a given situation, because Aristotle's philosophy is absolute. But there's also a degree of relativity in between those absolutes, because Aristotle recognizes that there are different contexts in which you're going to naturally find yourself as you go about living your life, and these are going to involve different factors, you're going to have different priorities, and you really need to engage with your mind to figure out where reason lies in the choice available to you, and you need to select it and then act appropriately. And that's why consistency is important, because the decision to engage with one's reason and to seek out virtue and to attempt to behave in a way that leads one to virtuous behavior, not just physically, but to put one in that frame of mind where one is actively looking to do things for the right reasons and in the right manner, just not in a manner that is going to bring lot upon oneself. That's what he means by an excess of virtues. It's really showmanship and not actually about doing the right thing for the right reason, is the idea that this involves consistently looking for virtue, consistently looking for ways to apply it to one's life. And that develops a really staid sense of self, which is predictable, and also means that one's not likely to fly off the handle and go around violating the rights of others willy-nilly. The other important part of this comes from Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments. And this is the idea that when we see someone who is suffering, or when we watch the news and we see some case of someone's civil rights being violated, then we get upset. And we get upset because we imagine ourselves in the same situation and how angry we would be if it were our rights being violated. And for this reason, we look to avoid treating others in a way that we know would be upsetting to us. So it's a grounding in our own ego. Respecting the rights of others really comes from a love of our own liberty. Now, these two ideas, the idea of consistency of character and the idea of self, and their basis in the natural rights philosophy, applies primarily to individuals. And this is why individualism is so important to a free society, because individuals are the primary actors who are engaging in behavior and who are capable of reasoning and of making these determinations for themselves. But the question is, does the same standard of conduct apply to states? And when we anthropomorphize the state and we give them the ability to discriminate in the same way and to empathize in the same way, effectively what we've done is turned the state from a neutral body that simply applies a set of standards, right? The idea of rule of law, which is the idea of consistent conduct, but taken at a level of government. But when we anthropomorphize the state and turn it into a sort of a living being, we don't just do that in part. What we're also doing is empowering the state to reason and to feel. And when it does that, those aren't the only aspects of a living entity that it receives. It also is going to have a survival instinct. The idea that when you have empowered government officials who are making cost-benefit analyses and determining what groups should receive benefits and what groups can be sacrificed in the short term, meaning that their interests aren't as exigent and therefore aren't as worthy of government protection, that essentially means that government is empowered and government is making empathetic and sympathetic judgments. And when it's doing that, it also is eventually going to start pursuing its own interests because it can reason, it can think, and now it has a survival instinct. So you've essentially given life to government, and that ultimately becomes problematic when it runs up against competing self-interests, i.e. individuals who live underneath the rule of government. And ultimately, that's not a clash that's going to work in favor of individuals because government has a monopoly on force. And this is why we want to avoid anything that anthropomorphizes the state and encourages giving it powers where it solves social problems rather than the individual. If virtue is defined as a consistent standard of conduct, and this is connected to reason, and the state can't reason or think or feel without infringing on individual rights, then how do we have a standard of government where we can actually protect individual rights? Because this involves a completely neutral, completely dead state. Dead in the sense that it's not making any empathetic judgments about right and wrong. It's not advocating on behalf of certain individuals in the way that actual individuals do when they see wrong done in civil society and take action. Again, drawing on that Adam Smith idea that we abhor wrong because we imagine what it would be like were it done to us. Well, this is where the rule of law really comes into play. And this is the idea that there is one standard of justice which is applied equally in all cases. And this is true not just of those in the polity, but of those in government as well. And this is what distinguishes the American framework of government really from everything that's come before. And the idea that law is not some set of standards of conduct which government imposes upon the citizenry to attempt to control them and to create a situation of long-term stability that leads to the survival of the state. The idea being that the welfare of the citizen is bound up in the survival of the state since it provides services that benefit those citizens, but rather that the law code is as much a stricture upon the conduct of those in government as it is on the citizenry. And the basis of virtue there is the idea that anything that infringes on rights is wrong, and any other moral judgments are left to civil society to deal with. And the idea that government is inherently limited and that there is a high wall of separation between the very truncated public realm and the much broader private realm wherein individuals are free to sort moral questions out for themselves, and only when someone infringes upon the rights of another are issues brought into the public realm, into the realm of government intervention. Intervention in this case merely being an adjudication on whether someone's rights have been infringed. And this is an idea that's put forth in the Federalist Papers by James Madison. And he talks about the idea that the first purposes of government is first to bind the citizenry and then to bind the government. And what he means by this is the institution of a law code that is applied equally to all individuals to prevent them from stepping on each other's toes, and then government officials must be held to the same standard of account and to conduct. And I think perhaps he has his priorities flipped there. I think perhaps it's important to bind government officials and then to bind the citizenry, since government has a monopoly on force. The idea that its wrongdoing is somehow secondary to the wrongdoing of citizens is, I think, a little bit reversed, because government has that monopoly on force, because its judgment is sort of final. I think it's far more important that the emphasis is put on controlling government than on the citizenry. But that's another story for another time. So what happens when rule of law is violated, and what happens when the standard of conduct becomes more reflective of individualistic behaviors? What happens when we have a living state and when government is able to make judgments? Well, for a start, the concept of virtue, which a state models when it starts to behave like an individual, is not the Aristotelian idea of consistent standards of conduct developed over time and applied to all areas of living. Rather, it is a reflection of survival instincts and the idea that anything that materially benefits the state is good, and anything that is objectively a threat to the state is bad, or even anything that is questionable is seen as bad. Because in a state of nature, or when you're out in the wilderness, if there is some uncertainty, it must be seen as a threat to one's continued existence and therefore avoided. And this is a collective view too, because the individual members of the polity rely on the state's stability and on the benefits that they receive from living under the state's protection. Their welfare is swept up in the collective welfare of the polity. So it's not a pluralistic collective where individuals still retain their autonomy. It is a collective where the good of all is defined as the good of the one. And there's no consistency that is modeled here, because there really doesn't need to be, because the state has a monopoly on force. And we don't need to look any further than the protectionist trade agenda being pursued by the Trump administration to see the kinds of inconsistencies that develop, and how there is no one standard of conduct in the way that laws are conceived and enforced, which effectively means that there is no rule of law and there is no true morality, because standards change. And we can see this in the way that the nations with whom we're trading are treated very differently when we're talking about importing their products into our country, and when we're talking about exporting our products into their countries. Right, and the idea that anything that is not an American good is a threat to American production and American welfare, that the very presence of imported steel and aluminum somehow hurts American consumers and national security. So there's the idea that imported goods need almost a second class. There's almost a tiered system that's created. And this same standard does not apply in reverse. When we're talking about American goods, which are exported overseas, there is not then the expectation that they will take second place in the economies of foreign countries to the goods which they have produced, right? The idea that our national sovereignty must reign supreme in terms of our domestic economy is not a principle that's then extended to other countries. There's no reflexivity of rights, right? This is the quasi-mercantilism of Trump's agenda. The idea that at home American goods need to be supreme and that everyone needs to take second fiddle to American production, but that also applies overseas. It's not the fact that when we're trading with Canada or the European Union or China, the idea that they have the right to have the same kind of control over their economy and to impose tariffs on our goods under the same principle that anything that doesn't come from within is a threat to their survival. That, according to the president, is a raw deal and is unfair. And the idea that American supremacy then extends not just within the borders of the United States, but globally, and that even when we're dealing with different sovereign nations, our sovereignty still reigns supreme and everyone else is still second tier. So there is no consistency of principle there. And we can see this too in the talk over the trade deficits and the idea that the president's main objection to what he calls unfair trade deals are the fact that we're being taken advantage of through trade deficits. Now, of course, this is a woefully illiterate view of how trade occurs. Trade deficits are a benefit to the consumer because it means that we're exchanging money for cheap goods, and that ultimately leads to a good sense of value. But the president's purported standard is trade deficits mean America is being taken advantage of, and we need to impose some sort of sanction against those who are engaging in this kind of unjust behavior to try and get them to change their ways. Which, all right, let's just accept that for a second as a standard of virtue. However, in terms of the steel and aluminum tariff, Canada and the United Kingdom are two nations with which we actually have trade surpluses. So one would think that they would be just on their face exempt from the tariffs. But no, we are currently levying tariffs against them. As a matter of fact, Canada levies protectionist tariffs against imported milk in order to protect its domestic milk production. And this is something that the president has complained bitterly about because he claims it's unfair to America, even though he's turned around and engaged in exactly the same sort of behavior with regards to trade with Canada in the way that they import certain goods into the country. So you can see that there's not that consistent set of application of values. The morality does not work both ways. There's the idea that the supremacy of the United States is unlimited and that the respect which is required of other nations in the way that they engage with us is not expected of others. So this is not a standard that in any way is based on consistency, on any sort of reflexivity of rights. There's no respect for any partner with whom we interact if they are in any way different from ourselves. And ultimately, this is not because there is this lack of respect, because there is this expectation that our standards are going to be accepted, that foreign sovereign nations will be told how to behave, not only in regards to how they interact with us in what they're importing into our country where we have sovereign control over our own affairs, but that same principle doesn't apply to them, that our sovereignty somehow supersedes their own sovereignty within their own borders is ultimately, well, for one, it's violative of the idea that rights are reflective, and it's also ultimately principleless. Even though it claims that there is some principle at the heart of it, it's not applied consistently.